Hi gang, so one of the things I really like is custom bases. Most of my armies have them, and I try and theme my forces so that, say, all the Imperial forces I have similar bases, or Chaos forces all have similar bases. Sometimes I just use regular Games Workshop SCENIC bases, and sometimes I use third-party RESIN bases, but one of the things I've really enjoyed doing over the last few years has been making my own and then casting them so that I have enough for an army. This has a few obvious advantages. Buying resin bases for an entire army can be expensive, for one thing, and making your own works out at pennies per base, and making your own also allows you to get exactly what you want, but mostly I have loads of older metal models which really benefit from slotta bases. Without their slots, they'd need pinning to regular bases. So being able to make my own SCENIC slotta bases is really useful. So in this video, I'm going to show you how to make your own SCENIC bases with and without slots, how to make a mold from them, and then how to cast them in resin. But hold on, Ian, you might say. It's 2022. Why are you casting bases instead of just 3D printing them? Well, yeah, I also have some fantastic bases that I can 3D print, and as long as you know what you're doing, you can get really good results with your 3D printer. I have an Elegoo Mars 2 Pro and also an older Elegoo Mars that I don't use that much anymore, and the bases I've printed on it look really, really good. But 3D printing might not be available to everyone, and 3D printing still takes time. Don't get me wrong, the Mars 2 is a lot faster than my old one, and 3D printers are getting faster all the time, but it still takes a decent amount of time to get one build plate's worth of bases. With resin casting, the setup time's a bit longer, but once you have the mold, you can just do a whole new set every 15 minutes, which is really useful when you're making big armies. So 3D printing is great, especially for special character bases and one-offs, but I think resin casting still has a place. I've been casting my own resin bases for a few years now, and I have a few options I use for my armies, from trench bases to ruined temple bases, but today I'm going to be building some tech bases. I use some variant of tech sort of spaceship bases for all my Imperial armies in Warhammer 40k, but none of the store-bought versions have slots, and I want to make some for these guys, some old metal squat models. So for these, I'll need a mix of slotta and non-slotta bases. I'll be making these pretty quickly, and I'm not using any particularly complicated equipment like pressure pots, so I'm not expecting the casting to be as crisp as either plastic bases or as 3D printed ones. In fact, to be fair, something like ruined bases would have hidden the problems much better, but hey, whatever, I need tech bases, that's what the tutorial's on. First, we're going to make the bases themselves. I assemble my materials. I have a selection of basic black bases ranging from 25mm up to 60mm. Then to decorate them, I'll be using a selection of plasticard sheet material, corrugated sheeting, deck plating, and rivet plates, as well as some plain 1mm plasticard. You can get this sort of stuff online or from architectural model shops, and they're really useful for terrain building. To add detail, I'll be using plasticard tubing, the odd spare techie-looking model bit, and this flexible resin from Zinj Industries. These are actually a load of miscasts I picked up at a convention a few years ago, but they'll be perfect for edging and creating borders between the different base textures. I start out by cutting small rectangles out of the sheet material with a scalpel and supergluing them to the bases. You don't need to cut all the way through, you can usually just score and snap the plasticard. I'm trying to get a couple of different textures on each base, even if that's just one of the sheet materials with a rivet strip down the side. Don't worry about the overhang at this point, just stick the rectangles on and line them up until each base has a couple of surfaces on it. When it comes to the slotta bases, I'm going straight over the slot, but I'm trying to make sure I don't vary the height of the base too much along the line of the slot, since models on slots usually have feet overhanging that slot, and a difference in height might make the model stand proud of the base. Finally, as the early ones dry, I trim off a bit of the overhang and reuse it to fill in the gaps on the later bases. Waste not, want not. Once that's done, I glue pipes, tubes, and tech bits to any of the large flat areas, again making sure these don't cross the slots and leaving a gap around where a slot would be so that the model's feet still have enough space. We're only going to be doing a one-piece drop mold here, so don't add anything to the bases that sticks up too much or is too spindly, or has a big overhang. The curves on these pipes should be fine. Once that's done, I roughly trim the excess down with a scalpel and clippers and then carefully go around the edge with the scalpel. This is a good time to put on a fresh knife blade. It takes a bit of getting used to get a good matching edge. Sometimes I make one long cut and sometimes short, sharp shavings help. Try saying that 5 times faster. Finally, I use a fine sandpaper to sand down the sides of the bases. If you like, and if you've got like a gap, you can also use something like milliput or green stuff to fill in the edges, but I think these are shallow enough not to bother me. So there we are, basically just gluing stuff to bases and then sanding it down. It's a pretty fun way to spend an evening. Here are my finished tech bases. And of course, if that's all you need, you can just stop there, make some more. However, the next step for me is to cast them. So what ingredients do we need? Well, first you'll need some silicone casting rubber. I use SilMaster 380 or 390, which comes with a catalyst you stir in to activate the setting. 390 is the stiffest rubber they make and is sold by the kilo. Similarly, you'll need some casting resin. I'm using SilMaster G27 LV, which is a 2-part resin that sets pretty quickly, about 15 minutes till it's solid. I'm using the low viscosity, that's the LV version, as the sort of thing I'm casting obviously has really small details, so something that's a little bit more liquidy will get into all of those. You'll then need some general bits and bobs. Lego or similar brick-based toy is useful to create the mold, pipettes to measure out resin, some old sticks or lollipop sticks to mix with, and some cocktail sticks or toothpicks to root out any rogue air pockets. I use cleaned out food cans, which is a good way to recycle them. And finally, a small set of scales. Any sufficiently accurate kitchen scale is fine, but I'd recommend getting a cheap one specifically for this because, yeah, they get a bit messy over time. The first thing I do is assemble my mold frame out of Lego. This isn't actual Lego, it's a similar product I got from a Japanese model shop in Tokyo, but it does the same job. I lay out the bases as a guide. I want to keep a few mil of space between each base, and nothing should touch the sides. Once the frame is complete, I cut a bit of plasticard to the same size and glue the bases down to it, just with super glue so they can be broken off later. I'm doing this because I don't want to glue to the Lego, and because the Lego has an annoying knobbly bottom, which will make cleaning up the mold much more difficult later. I then mix my silicone. This stuff requires 6 mil of catalyst per 100 mil of rubber. My pipettes are 3 mil, so I measure out the rubber on my scales, add the correct amount of catalyst, and mix together until the color is consistent. This is actually a really big mold for me. I usually do a smaller set of bases, and I recommend starting with a smaller set. This is huge. So while I took a guess at 300 mil of rubber, I actually ended up having to add some more later to top it up. When the rubber is mixed, I start to pour, but here's where the camera turned itself off, and you can't really stop yourself once you've started, so trust me, it gets poured. Here's some stock pouring footage. Basically, if you pour slowly and gently, usually around the bases, not directly onto them, and let the rubber ooze its way into any slots or crevices, then you should be fine. Once the rubber's in, I take a cocktail stick and I find all the slots and just root around inside them to free any air that might have got trapped in there. However steadily you pour them, there's always a chance of this sort of thing happening. Right, now that goes on a totally flat surface to cure, which takes about 8 hours. Okay, here we are. As you can see, I had to add a bit more rubber from a different batch when the first lot cured, and some pieces were still poking out. But it's all dry now and time to demold. First, I break apart the Lego and free the mold using a scalpel to cut off all the straggly little ends. I then remove the plasticard along with all the bases, being careful to let each one pop out of its own accord and trying not to tear any of the mold. There's always tiny little bits that come loose with this, and they'll start to come loose in the first few castings anyway, but you don't want to tear any of the big bits. Finally, I go around with a scalpel and just tidy up any flash or straggly ends. You can see the slots here for the slotter bases, and I just shorten them all a bit and cut off the loose ends to make the thinnest part of the base a bit thicker and sturdier. Resin's a lot more brittle than plastic, and I don't want those thin bits to snap. If this makes the slots a bit shorter than they need to be, well fine, we can always cut down the slots on the models. Right, once the mold has been tidied up, we're ready to cast. I'm using the 2-part resin from SilMaster. This resin is mixed in a roughly 50-50 ratio, and if you were doing something huge, you could just use a disposable measuring cup, but for this amount, I just use pipettes to measure out the same amount of each. I'm guessing 10 squirts of each part. It goes without saying that you really don't want to mix up these pipettes after you've started using them. Put them down next to the correct tin. I also have to move fast as the resin starts to thicken after only a couple of minutes, which is why this is all one big shot. It just gets a quick stir with a cocktail stick, and then I pour directly into the mold, trying to keep the level just under the lip of the base impressions. I don't want the surface tension of the liquid to cause a sort of rounded bump on the top. Again, you can go around with one of the toothpicks if you think you've got any air bubbles in there. All resins vary, but this one needs about 15 minutes before the bases are cured enough to demold them. So let's pop them out. Important thing to note here is they probably need a little longer to go properly hard, so now is the ideal time to cut off any flash or pop off any bubbles. It'll be way easier now than it will in about a day's time. And there we go. our first batch of bases. And yeah, they look pretty good. As you might have gathered, this is about the quickest, most DIY way to do resin casting, which means they're not perfect. There's some air bubbles caught in the tiny little nuts and bolts and stuff like that. Stuff that might be easier to solve with more equipment or pressure pots, but then you'd need more equipment. As it is, my bases are going to be pretty weathered anyway, and I'm not planning to sell them, so they're fine for me. And this sort of thing is even less of a problem on ruins or rubble bases. Now I have the mold and resin all set up, I can just keep going. Within a few hours, I could have enough for an army, and at a fraction of the price of store-bought ones. Anyway, once they're fully cured, they can be used. Slotless models can be drilled or pinned, just like any other resin base, and slotted models just attached to the slot and the join covered up with a bit of ballast or green stuff. There we go. Some happy old squats, all safe on their custom resin bases. Much safer than if they were pinned. I hope this video has been useful. Like the other option 3D printing, resin casting can be quite a big thing to get into, with a bit of an outlay in terms of liquids and gubbins. This entire kit of Silmaster stuff can be bought for about 50 quid in the UK, but once you've got it all, the process of casting a new bit is really simple, if a bit messy. If you're looking for a fun little modelling project that's really hands-on, or you want to start with resin moulding and casting, then bases are the perfect way to do that. Good luck, and see you next time. If you're looking for more Warhammer modelling content, there should be a suitable video just popping up there on the right. Otherwise, do all the usual YouTube stuff, like and subscribe, and there's a Patreon link below. See ya!